Well, hey there, this is Cindy, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really glad that you're here, and I cannot wait for you to hear today's episode. I can't wait to jump into the discussion myself. Before we dive in, though, just wanted to share a few ways that we can work together if you're looking to uplevel your negotiation skills. I've got online group or my signature VIP or mastermind experiences available. It'll help you better leverage your innate or natural power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And now the reason you are here on to today's program, I am so happy to introduce you to Dr. Thandi. And we are going to be talking about negotiating as a Black woman and negotiating in the face of racism. This is an issue that's getting a lot of airplay today, but we've still got a long way to go. So, Dr. Thandi, you have jumped into some professions that are known for being very male-dominated and masculine-driven. And I'm thinking of the medical profession for sure, and the military as well. Can you share some insights about how you navigated or negotiated in those environments generally, and also how you negotiated while navigating sexism?
Yeah, there's a woman who talks about the intersectionality of race and gender, and how, at all times I am a Black woman, and I can't separate those two things. And so sometimes it's the Blackness, sometimes it's a womanness, and you never know. But yeah, for sure, the military is definitely a male-dominated field, and even just navigating things like, what do I do with my children when I have to go away, and how I can't. And I think one of the most powerful things that I've learned to say is no.
Yes, so true.
I can't do that. Sorry, I can't. And that means that sometimes I can't show up. There are trainings for the military that I say I can't go to because I have a responsibility with my children for. And the same thing with medicine is sometimes there are conferences that I can't go to, or meetings after work that I can't go to because I have to pick my kids up for after school and give them a bath and feed them. And so that's a constant negotiation. And one of the biggest negotiations with that is negotiating the guilt.
Yes.
Right. The mom guilt is huge. And just really allowing myself to be okay with the choices that I make, and realize that I'm making the choices that I'm making for a reason. And ultimately it's always with my children's best interest in mind. If I don't show up to work, there's nobody that's going to pay the rent. And it's kind of important. Yeah. And that means that I've always questioned these schools, like, who are these parents that can show up at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday? Like, who are you gearing this towards?
Absolutely.
That means that I'm going to miss some of those at this stage in my life. Maybe in another season, I will have a different schedule. But for the schedule that I have right now, that means I'm going to miss those things. And at the same time, at work, I am going to, some days I have to, like on Friday, I had to leave by a certain time because I had a parent-teacher conference, and that was non-negotiable. So it's just about figuring out what is non-negotiable for me and deciding where those boundaries are. And then as a woman, it's interesting. So the other person I work with is an older Black male. And I've heard patients in the waiting room who I've never met, and they would say, I don't want to see the girl doctor.
Wow.
And that's just what it is.
Yeah.
That's just what it is. And I've had other patients that have had literally swastika tattoos on their neck. Wow. That I was a little bit nervous to take care of, but they were respectful. I find that when it comes to sexism versus racism, people feel more free to express their dislike of or disapproval of women than they are to come out and say to your face. Like, so let's say, like, I had I had a little 90-something-year-old lady, and she was like, "Well, I I never liked women doctors because I always thought the men were better. But if I were to have a woman doctor, I would choose you."
Wow.
I mean, how can you even? I can't even be mad at
Yeah. Yeah.
at at her. And then a lot of times they, with the racism portion, it's more of a lot of microaggressions. And
Yeah.
I actually have a physician colleague that she just got so fed up. She got fed up with burnout and the racism and gender issues that she literally moved to Guam.
Wow.
She moved to
That's an
Guam.
extreme reaction.
We did. We can, obviously, that's not a viable solution for
Yeah.
all of us. And I said, "How is it different practicing in Guam?" And she's like, "Oh, it's so much better." She says,
Really?
I don't constantly have to, I'm not constantly being questioned about my right to be in the
Yeah.
room."
Yeah.
And it, sometimes we don't realize it, but that it wears on your soul when your right to be in the room, when your right to be doing what you're doing is constantly being questioned.
Yeah.
It's almost like death by a thousand paper cuts. It exhausts you on a level that you don't always realize when it's happening at the time.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that there's starting to be a revolution in medicine, a quiet revolution where people are actually recognizing, and organizations are recognizing, that physician wellness actually matters.
Yeah.
It matters that our doctors are well. And alongside that, although not to the level where I think it needs to be, there is a recognition that we need to have environments that have zero tolerance for racism or racist
Yeah.
behaviors.
Yeah. Well, and first, thank you, a heartfelt thank you for speaking to the elephant in the room. I think we need to start talking about it more and having open dialogue about this if we're going to affect meaningful change. And what a sad commentary that moving to Guam was actually a solution for her, that, she didn't get that kind of questioning about your right to be in the room. And for those who aren't ready to move to Guam, I love, and I just want to put a pin in some of the comments that Dr. Thandi made there that are great practical solutions as well. Know what your non-negotiables are. Be comfortable learning to say no, set those boundaries for yourself, and release any guilt that you have on those issues. So I thought they were fabulous little sort of really practical, simple steps that people can take right now. And did you have any other tips on, like, how do you negotiate beyond racism, frankly?
There's this show on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called How to Get Rich. Have you seen it?
Oh, no, I haven't even heard of it. I'll have to check.
And it's not rich in terms of how to make a lot of money, although of course money is a big part of the show. But
Yeah.
one of the questions the host asks all the guests is, what does your rich life look like? What is your rich life? What, like, if you could design your life and you could live the life of your dreams, what would it look like? What would it feel like? And taking some time to contemplate that, and then creating a life that moves in that direction, making decisions, negotiating, whether it's, like I said, a lot of minorities, a lot of women are making less, going back to the table and justifying why you should get, and it's not even like a little bit less, it's like a lot of bit less. Like one woman was making $200,000 less than her male counterpart.
That's insane.
Yeah. Like crazy. So going back to the table, asking for those questions, finding places that feel comfortable and accepting of you. And it might mean that you have to go through a few jobs in the process. I have a girlfriend who, tragically, she's a Black female, and through some freak accident ended up becoming an amputee. One leg got amputated. So now she's a Black female with a disability.
Oh my
Right?
gosh. But
Her employer, even after she had been cleared by her doctors, her employer didn't want to let her come back to work. And she realized very quickly, like, this is a place that is not going to be supportive of me. And she found another job. So it might mean finding another job. It might mean starting your own business. I find that a lot of Black women who are thriving in medicine have their own businesses because they get to set they get to make the rules.
Yeah.
So whatever it's going to take to create that comfortable space for you to thrive in, start taking steps to do that.
Yeah. That's gorgeous advice. And again, thanks for raising about the stats on that, because it was one of the things at the introduction of my Art of Feminine Negotiation book I talk about, because it was stunning to me, the discrepancy. You know, I mean, women make less than men, women of color make less than white women with disabilities make less than all of the above. Like, it's sort of this hierarchy of this massive gap that keeps getting further and further. And, you know, we pay a lot of lip service to diversity and equity and inclusion, but there's still so much to go. And speaking of diversity, what's been your experience, like in organizations where there is diversity, what impact has that had in your view on like negotiations in your experience?
What organizations have diversity? That's my first question. But seriously,
that is so good.
I mean, ophthalmologists, out of ophthalmologists, less than 3% are African American, and even less than that are African American women. So when I go to meetings, it's a sea of ocean of white men mostly.
Yeah.
So there are not a lot of spaces where there are a lot of people that look like me. The National Medical Association, I guess, is one organization that was actually, so the National Medical Association is an association that is there to support the issues that are health issues that are relevant to African Americans.
Yeah.
And it was started because African American physicians were not allowed to join the American Medical Association, which was the biggest, largest medical association in America and maybe even the world. So when we go to the National Medical Association, the ophthalmology section meetings, that's when I see people who look like me. And interestingly, one of the things that and probably one of the best pieces of advice that I got from this emergency medicine doctor, he said, there will be people that you will come across who want to help you. Let them help you. Mm-hmm. And I always assumed that my biggest supporters would be people that look like me, but that's not necessarily the case. And one of my biggest mentors is an older, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white male who has been a huge supporter. And I've had other women who look like me who have not been my supporters. So it's like, go where you find your help.
That's great advice. And I say it as a joke, but it's not a joke, because it's a sad commentary that, you know, I found in law, some of the worst resistance I got were from the few women who had come before me, right? And I often joke when we talk, those women who do get through the glass ceiling, and we find this, I think, across the board. I don't know if that's the case with racial discrimination as well, but those people get through the glass ceiling, not only did they not reach down and give a helping hand, but they go hire a professional glazier and glaze over the ceiling again, right? It's like, you know, what is wrong with this picture? And I just want to circle back for all our listeners to really take a moment to let that sink in, because I thought Dr. Thandi's answer when I said, you know, in organizations where they do have diversity, the fact that the genuine answer was, what organizations is that, reflects the depth of the work we still have to do on this issue. So I really wanted to put a pin in that, and I appreciate your honesty in that answer. I thought that was beautiful. So what advice or tips do you have for our listeners in how to handle, I would say, overt discrimination, which you alluded to earlier, but also those more subtle discriminations that you face sort of in negotiations and beyond?
I would say, in terms of the glass ceiling, one of the things that I do when I go to professional meetings is that I intentionally have 3 people, because I used to meet tons of people and I wouldn't keep in touch with anybody. So now my objective is I find 3 people that are ahead of me who can support me and mentor me in my future, as I move throughout my medical career. And then I find 3 people who are residents or who are younger than me, who I can support. And I think that is so important, that at all times we should be looking for people who can support us and people that we can support.
That is gorgeous. I love that. I love that. And one of the things I know, it's sometimes the case that individuals who are coming from either previously underrepresented or undervalued groups can be more likely to shy away from negotiating for a whole host of reasonings, loads of which are tied to social conditioning, but even more so, sort of shying away from advocating for themselves. So I'd love it. And you've already given some gorgeous tips that would apply, but any other advice for people who fit into that category who are not really sort of stepping up for themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of being a Black woman and being assertive is that we don't want to fit under the stereotype of the angry Black woman, but at the same time, we don't want to be taken advantage of.
Yep.
And I think that part of negotiating with anything is first dealing with your own discomfort in making the ask, and just really kind of taking some time to, because most people are not asking for ridiculous things. Most people are asking for reasonable things, whether it's I want to work a day less, or I want to get paid what my colleagues are getting paid. They're all very usually reasonable requests. And just kind of sitting with the discomfort and really becoming comfortable about how you have a right to ask.
Yeah.
A right to ask. I have been surprised, truly surprised in my life by how many things I have gotten just by asking. Just asking. And then taking the discomfort and asking anyway.
Yeah.
Ask anyway.
And we don't do that enough. I mean, the studies on that, people who ask get exponentially more than people who don't, right? I mean, it's remarkable. And just circling back to that idea about any advice about that overt or more subtle discrimination, when you face it, what's your position? Like, do you tend to call it out, or do you have some other strategies that you'd suggest?
I think it depends on the situation. I think that part of the strategy is creating a zero tolerance environment. So it is not just Black people's fight to fight racism. It should be everybody's, and it should be whether there should be a zero tolerance policy in the whole company. So whether a patient says something to one of my white colleagues, that person makes it clear that no, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I get the questions, the sort of subtle questions, depending on how energetic I'm feeling, I might just like, where are you from? I might ask, oh, I'm curious, why are you asking me that? Just kind of approach things with wonder and curiosity, where it's not combative or judgmental or attacking, but like, really, why are you asking?
Yeah. Or curiosity is one of my favorite words, frankly. I think when it comes to negotiating on potentially difficult issues, I think if you just get curious and ask those questions, it can be such a powerful motivator. And you were talking about that, having those mentors and being a mentor. And I think on this issue, I'd also advocate for people to have allies, right? Like build those relationships so that if you're at the table, for example, and somebody is stealing your ideas or taking credit for them or diminishing making those, whether subtle or overt, comments that are clearly discriminatory, that you've got an ally at the table who's going to speak up and say, oh, hey, Joe, thanks for repeating, Dr. Thandi's idea on that, or picking up the torch with that, where you've got those allies. And I'd be interested in your perspective, because one of the things I really sort of hear women agonizing over, and I've sort of flip-flopped back and forth, but have come down on the side of, you hear so much about, oh, well, if you want to be accepted, as a woman at the table, and I can imagine it's only even more amplified when, as you say, you deal with the intersectionality of gender and race, but just change your tone and change what. I'm not a fan of that anymore, because I think the more we keep showing up differently as less authentic versions of ourselves, like being afraid to be seen as the angry Black woman, if the thing that you're saying would be totally acceptable if it was a white male, for example, then maybe it's time we just start calling out some of this stuff, as you say, with curiosity, but having a discussion about it, rather than having women generally and or persons of color feeling the need to show up as less than their full authentic self, because it just in some ways perpetuates the problem. That was sort of where I'm landing on the perspective, but I'd love your thoughts on that, Dr. Thandi.
No, I agree completely. And even just on anger, male physicians are allowed to be angry in ways that female physicians are not. I remember I have a female physician colleague, and she was going through a nasty divorce with an abusive husband. And you can imagine she wasn't very happy as she was going through the process. And a nurse reported her because she didn't say, "How are you?" or smile. And she had to do some kind of like stupid, some kind of training, like psychosocial training or something absolutely ridiculous that a male doctor would never have to go through. But I believe in authenticity. I mean, obviously I believe in being controlled and intentional and deliberate, not out of control. But there are times when anger is absolutely the appropriate response to have. And I don't think, and I'm not going to be apologetic for it.
Yeah. And sometimes I think women in particular get accused of being angry when it's not actually even anger in ways that would never be, and women of color even more so, frankly. But I mean, I can't think how many times over the course of I know people are buzzing, "Oh, Cindy's such a bitch," right? Like in law, in ways that our male counterparts would be lauded for. And that issue is even more magnified, certainly for Black women. I mean, the fact that everybody talks about, having to recognize that as an issue about being categorized as an angry Black woman is that speaks to the problem that it's a live issue at all. Now, I would love your thought. I often say that, our first and most important negotiation is with ourselves, negotiating our own mindset. And obviously you do a lot of work around that. I love your philosophies, what you've shared with us so far. And I'd love if you could share some tips for our listeners about, how they can negotiate their mindset to help them step into the fullness of their power. Like we've talked about that, sort of the wage gap, for example. So whether it's setting our rates or getting the salary we deserve, or as you've talked about asking for what you want, what are some mindset sort of tricks or tips that you would suggest?
Actually, I put together a booklet for your listeners called The 10 Commandments of Happiness, the blueprint for living a soft life.
Oh, I love
So I'm really excited about that. But I think that if I could only say one thing, is just developing a practice of self-love.
Yes.
The self-love, because when you love yourself, you know that you're valuable.
Yeah.
You know that you deserve to give. And no one will ever pay you what you're worth. Yeah. Anything that you ask for will always be less than what you are worth. Yeah. I thought about like the Hope Diamond. It's $200 million. It's a rock. It's a rock. It's a rock. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to hold anybody or hug anybody. And it is made out of a material that is found in other places in the world. But no, like we are priceless.
Oh, that is so beautiful. And I'm so glad you called that out as well, because I think we've come to see it as woo-woo, right? And yet it's interesting. A lot of the concepts that back in the 60s, the so-called hippies were talking about, the science is now supporting a lot of that stuff. And, I was just having this conversation the other day with, well, frankly, at two different times with my two boys. And you could tell they were kind of like, oh my gosh, self-love was the immediate reaction. But I was like, just keep an open mind and, hear me out on this. Because when we get our value externally, we are always chasing after somebody else's perception of who we ought to be, their expectations of us. And everything shifts when you come from a place of absolute unconditional self-love and determine your value internally, intrinsically. So that was a gorgeous share. And any tips for mastering? We talked about anger, but I know you've done some work as well about mastering the emotional side of negotiations generally. I'd love your quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have been a student of personal development work for decades now. And a lot of personal development work focuses on the positive, comfortable emotions, right? Be happy, be joyous, be at peace, right? And that's all woo-woo and beautiful. It's all wonderful, right? I'm all for love, joy, and peace. But the reality of my experience is that I do not always feel love, joy, and peace. Sometimes I feel anger and ratchetness and shame and guilt and fear, and that's all a part of my experience. And I think sometimes we judge the comfortable emotions as good and the uncomfortable emotions as bad, or things that need to be conquered or overcome. And I have a different idea around that, and I believe that we need to embrace all of who we are as human beings. We need to embrace those uncomfortable feelings. And in fact, I find that when you suppress those uncomfortable feelings, they end up showing up in all kinds of weird and ugly ways. And whenever you're trying to do something to get to the next level, whether it's negotiating for a higher salary or more time off or a different job or whatever it is, there is going to be a discomfort there. And rather than, whenever you're doing anything that's new, there's a discomfort, and that's okay. Yeah. And rather than running away from that, kind of embracing that and sitting with it and talking to it and asking it to teach you. One of my other favorite quotes is, emotions make terrible masters, but wonderful servants. And if we allow our emotions to serve us and inform us and give us information that will help us along the way, they can actually be our friends. They can actually help us rather than be these things that we need to fight and overcome. And so even with negotiating, and sometimes the thing that is the most uncomfortable about negotiation is the silence.
Yeah.
It's the silence. I'm just going to drop this right here and I'm going to wait. And that's okay. Just sit in that silence, sit in that discomfort, just embrace it all.
Oh, so much there. So much there. Oh my gosh. And I'm smiling ear to ear because it is so resonant with what I believe and teach. And I love your expression of it and the emotions. And I'd never heard that quote before, is about the master and servant. I thought that was gorgeous. So thank you for that. I'm going to look that up and apply that and get that out there. But also leaning in, right? Like the flip side of that is, of what you said, which I think is so powerful. When we're in negotiations with somebody else who's getting emotional, our tendency is to be like, whoa, what is going on? And for me, that's where the gold is. If you can lean into that, and as you said earlier, get curious, like, okay, I seem to really hit a button here. Talk to me about that. What's going on? What can we do? That's where the real gold comes, because you really get to understand what the other party's deep-seated needs are, and you'll get those better, more creative outcomes. And I just wanted to touch on a point that, because I think you've really hit on something so important. And for our listeners there, when we only focus on the positive, or we're so conditioned to see it's okay to talk about this, but not that, I think we do a real disservice, particularly today with rising mental health issues, right? I mean, it's just anxiety, depression at all-time highs, suicide rates on the rise at unprecedented levels. And I hear a lot of people talk, one of my 3 kids has got diagnosed with a pretty serious mental health issue over COVID. That's been an ongoing negotiation. But you hear people criticize, oh, don't talk about it as suffering or this. No, you need to be able to name what it is. You can't just, whitewash it and assume that it's going to make everything okay. People need to be able to talk about the real experiences and emotions and tap into them in healthy ways. So I really appreciate you calling that out for what it is. Because I think we have become a society where personal development is so focused on, oh, just don't think about that. Just change your state immediately. And yes, there's a place for that. And it's also important to recognize it. This has been such an incredible conversation. I could just talk to you forever about this stuff and definitely want to get you back. I know you've got all kinds of other interesting areas we could have gone into. I normally like to wind up by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life, Dr. Thandi? It doesn't have to be on anything we talked about, just one of those moments that makes you look at things differently, show up differently. What would that be?
Yes, I'm so excited about this question because it was this huge light bulb moment for me. And it's just a simple concept. Soft is easier than hard.
Love that.
Soft is easier than hard. And I had a girlfriend who said to me, she said, you like to be on the struggle bus. And I said, what do you mean? And I started paying attention. What are all the ways? Because we live in this society where we're all like over busy and over stressed. And I said, what are the ways that I am making my life hard? And what are the ways that I could start making it easier? And when I feel like my calendar is overwhelming, I have to remind myself that, wait, I made that calendar. I can unmake it too.
That's so good.
And what is going to be softer? What is going to make life easier? What's going to allow me to flow? What's going to allow me to move in the world with ease? Because soft is easier than hard.
Oh, I love that. That is, as you say, it's so simple and so powerful and sadly so often overlooked. I wish we'd had this interview before I released my book. I would have, with your permission, borrowed that and put it in The Art of Feminine. That capsulites everything that The Art of Feminine Negotiation is about, right? Soft is better than hard. That is so good. So good. So tell us for our listeners, where can they learn more about you? And you'd mentioned about that resource that you were going to offer for our listeners. Tell us all about that.
Yes, you can get that pamphlet from my website, which is ThandiMD.com. Thandi is THANDI. MD as in medical doctor.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at dr.thandi, at TikTok, dr.thandi as well.
Oh, so good. So again, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So for the listeners, if you didn't catch that, don't worry. Although I would recommend you go back and listen to the episode anyhow, because there were so many great inspirational moments here and takeaways that will help you negotiate a better life. So thank you so much, Dr. Thandi, for being with us. I've really enjoyed our conversation here today.
I know. Thank you so much for having me, Cindy. This work is so important. Just keep up the good fight of faith.
Oh, and right back at you. And for our listeners, I have absolutely no doubt that you got tons of value from this episode. There were so many, we covered so many different aspects of ways in which you can negotiate your better life. We've tackled some pretty tough discussions. Make sure to share this with anyone that you think could benefit from the discussion, and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that yet. And also, if you haven't got my book, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom, make sure you grab that book. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, as always, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.